Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I'm a Tolkien scholar, and that means that I love to study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Some people like to call me an expert. I call myself scholar because I'm more about learning than teaching, but here I am answering your questions because a lot of people come to me with questions about the Tolkien Legendarium, the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, the Silmarillion, all of that good stuff, or just questions about Tolkien himself. And since I am always learning, I am happy to share it with you, and I have 15 questions to get through today. I'm going to be reading a little bit of The Return of the King, specifically from Appendix A today, from the section on Durin's Folk. And I think the reason that I actually was originally going to go with the tale of Aragorn and Arwen. But then when I opened to Appendix A and I saw Durin's Folk, lately I get a lot of questions specifically about Azog. Azog was a particularly nasty orc that lived in Moria. He was not very important. But because the Hobbit films, the Peter Jackson trilogy of Hobbit films, made him important. A lot of people think that he must have been important. He wasn't actually in The Hobbit. He died long before The Hobbit had come about. He never interacted with Thorin, and he would never been even to that part of the world, really. So I'm going to read you just a little bit about Azog, about that part of the story, which happened before The Hobbit, and actually involves not Thorin, but Thorin's grandfather, Thror, and a few other characters here as well. So the rumor of the wealth of Erebor spread abroad and reached the ears of the dragons, and at last Smaug the Golden, greatest of the dragons of his day, arose and without warning came against King Thror, and descended on the mountain in flames. It was not long before all that realm was destroyed, and the town of Dale nearby was ruined and deserted. But Smaug entered into the great hall, and lay there upon a bed of gold. From the sack and the burning many of Thror's kin escaped. And last of all, from the halls, by a secret door came Thror himself and his son Thrain II. They went away south with their family, long into homeless wandering. With them went also a small company of their kinsmen and faithful followers. Years afterwards, Thror, now old, poor, and desperate, gave to his son Thrain the one great treasure he still possessed, the last of the 7 rings. And then he went away with only one companion only, called Nar. Of the ring he said to Thrain at their parting, "This may prove the foundation of new fortune for you yet, though that seems unlikely, but it needs gold to breed gold." "Surely you do not think of returning to Erebor," said Thrain. "Not at my age," said Thror. "Our vengeance on Smaug I bequeath to you and your sons, but I am tired of poverty and the scorn of men. I go to see what I can find." He did not say where. He was a little crazed, perhaps, with age and misfortune and long brooding on the splendor of Moria in his forefathers' days. Or the ring, it may be, was turning to evil now that its master was awake, driving him to folly and destruction. From Dunland, where he was then dwelling, he went north with Nar, and they crossed the Redhorn Pass and came down into Azanulzabar. When Thror came to Moria, the gate was open. Nar begged him to beware, but he took no heed of him, and walked proudly in as an heir that returns. But he did not come back. Nar stayed near by for many days in hiding. One day he heard a loud shout, and the blare of a horn, and a body was flung out from the steps. Fearing that it was Thror, he began to creep near, but there came a voice from within the gate. "Come on, Beardling, we can see you. But there is no need to be afraid today. We need you as a messenger." Then Nar came up, and found that it was indeed the body of Thror, but the head was severed and lay face downward. As he knelt there, he heard orc laughter in the shadows, and the voice said, "If beggars will not wait at the door, but sneak in to try thieving, that is what we do to them. If any of your people poke their foul beards in here, to know who is now king here, the name is written on his face. I wrote it. I killed him. I am the master." Then Nar turned the head and saw branded on the brow in dwarf runes, so that he could read it, the name Azog. That name was branded in his heart and in the hearts of all the dwarves afterwards. Nar stooped to take the head, but the voice of Azog said, "Drop it. Be off. Here's your fee, Beggarbeard." A small bag struck him. It held a few coins of little worth. Weeping, Nar fled down the Silver Lode. But he looked back once and saw that orcs had come from the gate and were hacking up the body and flinging the pieces to the black crows. Pretty grim stuff. So that's Azog's introduction, and then what happens after that is he's revenged. Is that Dane the Second's father, Nain, I believe his name was, came with a force, and they had the Battle of Alzunzabar. It's a hard word to say, and that is when Azog was indeed slain, and that was long before the Hobbit. So anyway, just one second, I wanted to. Sorry, I'm just answering somebody. Okay, so let's get to your questions. I'm sorry, somebody messaged me on Discord, and I wanted to make sure I answered them before I neglected to. You know how sometimes somebody tries to get a hold of you and you're like, oh, I'll get back to that. And then you don't, and you see it and you're like, oh dear, sorry. I just got this. But you really did. Well, not just got this, but I just got to this. But anyway, we have 15 questions for you here today. And this, let's start with this one. Oh, you know what? I love this question. This is a really, really good question. And I did not see the name on this. Man, this one came in anonymously, which is a shame because I really want to just give a shout out to the person that, well, let me see if I can find the name. Yeah, I'm not going to say it, but I just shout out to you, AG. I'll say the initials because, what a good question. It made me think of something that I'd never thought of before. So here's the question. Did the absence of Narya from the Fellowship at the end of A Fellowship of the Ring play an important role in Boromir trying to take the ring? And wow, what a good question. That is a really very thought-provoking question. Well done. So for anybody that doesn't know what Narya is, that's Gandalf's Ring of Power. Narya, the Red Ring. It didn't really bestow upon him great power like some people think. It was really for his own benefit. It kept him going. It gave him stamina, warmth, comfort, and aid in, and this is what Círdan the Mariner said when he gave it to him, giving courage and wisdom to others. This is why I think you're onto something with this. I can't say for sure yes or for sure no, but I think you're onto something. And I brought this up with a few other people, and they were like, wow, this guy's onto something, So really, really good job on thinking of that. Boromir didn't start acting funny until they left Lothlorien. You could chalk this up to Galadriel giving him the mental once over, and which Sam described as being sort of like being looked at naked. But Gandalf's absence and the soothing influence of his ring may have had a part to play in it, and the fact that, there was another ring of power in play there, Nenya, which is Galadriel's ring. So up until that point, like at the end of Moria, everybody was sort of feeling the effects of Gandalf's wisdom and his patience and giving aid and comfort and courage and wisdom to other people. And then he was gone, and they were in Lothlorien, where they're under sort of a similar protection from Galadriel. Then they leave, and for the first time, there is no Elven Ring of Power. There's no Elrond, there's no Galadriel, there's no Gandalf with them. So I think you might be onto something. That may have played a part in Boromir eventually breaking down and succumbing to the seduction of the One Ring. I'm not saying that that's for sure the case, but it may have been a contributing factor. Usually when people speak of Narya, they attribute it to all sorts of things that don't really make any sense, but this actually fits with the function of the ring. So the real answer is, I don't know, but I think you're onto something. Okay, next question. Oh, that's the same one. Okay, here we are. Hopefully I didn't miscount. Okay, this one came in from Harry Pringle. Harry sent me a few questions before, and this one's interesting because I get this one a lot, and I think that people sort of Well, I'll say what people sort of do after I read the question. Why did it take Gandalf 17 years of research to find out that the ring that Bilbo found was the One Ring? Also, did he suspect it could be the One Ring, or was he just curious about the exact nature of the ring? So I think that the issue is people, Gandalf was suspicious. He goes off for 17 years, which is not really entirely accurate, but I'll get to that in a moment. He comes back, and then he does one final test, and he determines 100% that's the One Ring. Why did it take that long? It wasn't the only thing he had going on, and I'm going to get into that. But Gandalf was not doing research for 17 years. He did research during that time, but he was spinning a lot of plates. Gandalf's suspicions, let's talk about that first. They started the very moment that he first heard the phrase magic ring, and he was quite inquisitive as to how Bilbo came to possess such a thing. Bilbo told what was an obvious lie, which concerned Gandalf greatly. Bilbo was generally a very honest person who didn't tell lies easily, and people who are honest are usually really bad at lying. I can tell you that myself. I'm an honest person, and the reason I'm an honest person is because I never get away with lying. If I ever lie, I'm found out just pretty much immediately. It never works out. So just for, lack of embarrassment, I just don't lie. So it took a long time for Gandalf to extract the truth from Bilbo. The difference between the story that Bilbo told and the truth it's a minor difference, but it's important. The distinction is important for two main reasons. The first is that Bilbo had no reason to lie. And the second is that the lie made no sense. Frodo himself stated that he liked the true story better than what was written in Bilbo's book. Anyway, you can see that very early on Gandalf was concerned about the ring, though he hoped it was one of those lesser rings, which you don't hear much about. They were practice attempts that the elves made before they started making rings of power. Essays in the craft is the exact wording that Gandalf used. He feared that it might have been a ring of power. As such things are dangerous to keep, he urged Bilbo to give it up and to leave it to Frodo, and the fight that Bilbo put up in this case, even going so far as to accuse Gandalf of trying to steal the ring, concerned him greatly. So in this time period, between the birthday party and Gandalf revealing that it is indeed the One Ring, a lot happened. But before I address that, it wasn't exactly 17, it was a little bit less than 17 years, because you have to remember Frodo didn't leave right away. He spent some time, selling his house and preparing to move to Crick Hollow and everything, and fostering rumors about how he had run out of money. So there was a few months that he was there, well, more than a few months. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to show that it wasn't exactly, it was nearly 17 years. Anyway, the first culprit as to why it took so long was Saruman. Gandalf had, at some point in the past, actually broached the subject of the One Ring possibly resurfacing to Saruman, and Gandalf had no reason to distrust him at this point. He trusted the wisdom of Saruman, and Saruman just sort of hand-waved it away. Not only did Saruman claim that the One Ring had washed down the river into the sea where it was lost forever, he made his claim in a way that hinted that he had special knowledge of this. Saruman, of course, had already found Isildur's remains, and he had been searching for the One himself. The next issue is travel times and distances. Gandalf had to study in Rivendell and Gondor both, and this was before he had Shadowfax around to travel quickly. He had to discover Isildur's account buried deep in the libraries of Minas Tirith. And before I continue on that, I had a really good comment on this on Quora about the whole... here it is from Nick. Nick said, the libraries of Minas Tirith and Rivendell also presumably did not have the Dewey Decimal System to make things easy to find. The best they had is something like, I think our scrolls related to the line of Elendil are somewhere in sub-basement 5, and accounts at the beginning of the Third Age are on the 3rd floor of Tower number 2. Anarian's great-grandson sent us some scrolls when Gondor was fighting Angmar, and I think those are still in the miscellaneous to be sorted pile. So there's, Nick... the commenter there, he brought up a really good point that it probably wasn't quick. It wasn't just like, I know exactly where the information is. It's not like the internet. It's not like a library with a really, well-cataloged set of books. It's archives that are just dusty and forgotten and in languages that he may not be able to read. So there's a lot of things going on there. And then of course there's convincing the steward that, the steward who did not trust him to let him go through those archives. On top of all this, though, here's the biggest reason why it took many years. That wasn't the only thing he was doing. The research did not consume all of his time. By the time of Bilbo's 111th birthday, Sauron had already been openly declaring himself and waging war on Middle-earth for the past 5 decades. Gandalf was traveling all over, not just doing research, but helping various communities in their efforts in the war and convincing others that this is a war that mattered to them and getting people to work together and basically doing the job that he was sent there to Middle-earth to do. He was not gone from the Shire also for 16 years or 17 years. When he showed up to test the ring, Frodo mentioned he had not seen Gandalf for the past 9 years, so for a while he was checking in regularly with Frodo. So he was traveling from the Shire to Rivendell to Gondor and to a good number of other places, and doing a lot of different things. So it wasn't really 17 years of research. Okay. Next question. This one came in from Oscar Stainton. This is a really interesting one. Have you ever heard of anyone who watched The Rings of Power before reading or watching The Lord of the Rings? Yes. And that person is my grandmother, if you can believe it. My grandmother, she's still around. She's still kicking. She's in her 90s. And she never read The Lord of the Rings. She never saw any of the films until very recently, last year. Early last year. This is despite the fact that her daughter, my mother, was very into The Lord of the Rings in the 60s and onward, and passed that beautiful affliction on to me. My mother's the reason I got into all this stuff. The Rings of Power, to my grandmother, was just another TV show for her to binge on Amazon. It was essentially her inaugural first-hand experience with anything that was Tolkien related. So it got her interested enough to watch all 6 films, though at my urging, she ditched the idea of going in chronological order and watching The Hobbit first. She watched The Lord of the Rings and then she watched The Hobbit. So my grandmother's overall consensus, because I'm sure you're wondering, she liked the show, she loved The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit, she liked it, but she didn't like it as much as the other 2. She said they weren't as good. She does read fantasy novels, but I really just don't see her reading The Lord of the Rings. She actually attempted to start to read The Hobbit, but then she hopped off of it really quickly. So I don't see her reading The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or anything. She's more of a fan of like Outlander or Stormlight Archives and that kind of stuff. But I'll update you if she does ever read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or anything. I'll let you know. Okay, next question. This one is anonymous. Why was Boromir at the Council of Elrond? So this is interesting because it's really sort of 2 questions rolled into one if you think about it. So the question, why was Boromir at the Council of Elrond, sort of implies 2 questions. The first is easy. Why was Boromir in Rivendell at all? Why was he there? In the films, they made it seem like his father, Denethor, sent Boromir there specifically to get the ring. That he heard rumor of the One Ring, and he wanted Boromir to bring him a mighty gift. That's the way they handled it in the movies. The book, it was not like that. It was a different reason. Boromir's younger brother, Faramir, was visited by a dream. And in this dream, a voice spoke out of a light from the west with a capital W, meaning the Undying Lands, and gave him a bit of a poetry that was like a riddle. And the voice said, "Seek for the sword that was broken, for in Imladris it dwells. There shall be counsels taken, stronger than Morgul's spells. There shall be shown a token that doom is near at hand, for Isildur's bane shall waken, and the halfling forth shall stand." So, this came out of a light from the west, a vision from the Valar. Faramir, though, didn't have a reason to believe that it was anything but a dream, even if he had the dream 3 times, until he heard his brother, Boromir, had the dream as well. Boromir, the 3rd time, they both had the dream. So, a recurring dream is one thing, but when 2 people are having the same dream, that's special. That's a message from the Valar. So the brothers took this riddle to their father, Denethor II, because he was smarter than them in a lot of ways. He was a very wise man. I mean, Faramir was very smart too, but Denethor was older and knew a lot, and he didn't know what a halfling was. He didn't know what Isildur's bane was, but he knew Imladris. He knew that Imladris is Rivendell, an elven nation to the north. So Denethor didn't send Boromir, Denethor wanted Faramir to go. Faramir was the first one to get the dream, and he got it 3 times. But Boromir really wanted to go for whatever reason. It was never really explained exactly why Boromir insisted on going. But he insisted, and once Boromir makes up his mind, you can't change his mind. So that covers why he was there. Now, the next sort of question that is implied is, but why was he invited specifically to the council? For Merry and Pippin, for example, were not invited to the council. Sam was not invited to the council. He was there. He snuck in, but he wasn't actually invited. He stated that he sought the answer to the riddle, and he recited it, but it seems likely that he probably had already told the riddle to Elrond right when he arrived, and Elrond realized this might be important, especially since this guy is arriving at the same time that Frodo the Ring-Bearer is, and that's not a coincidence. Boromir was supposed to be there way earlier, but he lost his horse, he got lost. He basically wandered for a long time until he managed to get there and just happened to be at the same time as Frodo. So you could tell Elrond's this kind of guy. He's like, that's not a coincidence. There's something really going on here. So it was really important for Boromir to be at the Council of Elrond. Okay, next question. Okay, this one came in from Ari Zadok, who asks, does Tolkien's cosmology include any worlds beyond Arda, or is there only one habitable planet where all the gods and the mortals reside? No, in the current canon, no. Probably not, we'd say. But that's not to say that Tolkien didn't have an idea like that he didn't imagine such a thing. In the current canon, which is what was published in the Silmarillion and all of its related work, the world was flat, and then it became round during the Second Age, the Akalabeth. And the sun and the moon are a fruit and a flower of the 2 trees, which are carried through the sky by Maiar. There are no hints of other worlds in Ea other than Arda, though some of the stars that they speak of are analogous to other planets that we're familiar with. But we don't really know. I mean, like, Varda created the stars, it's a whole thing. Yarendil is analogous to Venus, but we know that it's a guy on a ship holding a Silmaril. The book Morgoth's Ring introduced a lot of changes, but are they actually canon changes? I would say no. Morgoth's Ring contains a lot of information, one of which was Tolkien's plan to do a demythologized version of the Silmarillion, which would frame the creation story and origins of the world as in-universe myths, while the actual truth was more in line with reality. The world was always round, the sun always existed, the lamps never existed. This also leads to some wild stories, such as Melkor creating the moon, and the moon being the seat of his power. Most relevant to the question, it did include the idea that Arda was not the only planet, and that there were other planets that were habitable, and that there were Ainur that went to these other worlds before they came, and some of them may have stayed there, and there may have been life on those other planets. Most of the other alternate versions that you see in the history of Middle-earth aren't really canon. They can be. There are aspects of them that absolutely can be considered canon if they don't contradict the Silmarillion. But most of these alternate drafts are early writings. They're sometimes more detailed, and that's why some aspects can be canon, as long as there's no contradictions. However, the demythologized version is not an earlier draft, it was a later draft. And normally we would say that the later something is, the more canon it is, because it replaces what came before. And Tolkien had rebooted his mythology several times, and he was planning to do another one. But here's the thing, he died. He didn't get very far with this. It's not much more than just a simple outline. After Tolkien died, his son, Christopher, who was his chief editor, considered trying to implement these changes into the Silmarillion, but they weren't fleshed out enough, so they were omitted. So while some contradictions made by later writings may be canon, such as Gil-galad being the son of Oropher, because that contradicts the Silmarillion, but it was a mistake that Christopher Tolkien admitted to. But he had a really excellent reason not to include the new revision of the cosmology. It was just unfinished. It was way too unfinished. It was only in the starting stages. There wasn't enough of it. So the answer is really no, but with the caveat that at one point later in life, Tolkien wanted the answer to be yes. but he never got around to fully implementing these changes, and he didn't really leave his son with enough to work with to make major changes to the Silmarillion. Okay, good question. Next question, this one comes in from Cole Johnson, who asks, what do you think would have changed if once Gandalf and the Balrog were at the peak of the mountain, the Balrog escaped by flying away, and Gandalf survived? If this happened, and this is the reason this is in the thumbnail, it would take a lot of explaining as to how a Balrog got like an eagle or a dragon to come by and give him a ride. Because what really this question is asking, what is the heart of this, is do Balrogs have wings? Can Balrogs fly? No and no. Balrogs don't have wings, despite many artistic interpretations that draw them with wings, because they're drawn in this grotesque form. And it's very popular for grotesques to be depicted with wings. But they weren't meant to be grotesques, which is sort of a fancy way of saying gargoyles. They weren't meant to be that. They were man-shaped. Men don't have wings, so Balrogs don't have wings. They were vaguely man-shaped. They can't fly. They can't fly with wings. They can't fly without wings. The wings of the Balrog that were referred to in The Lord of the Rings, it was an aura of shadow that spread like wings across the cavern. Gandalf had an argument with the Balrog, basically a very one-sided argument, and one of the things he said was he was a wielder of the flame of Anor. Anor means the sun. So what Gandalf is basically saying is, I know you're all about fire, but my fire burns greater. And the Balrog understands this and reacts to it because the fire in the Balrog dims and the shadow grows and it spreads like wings. It's a simple simile. It's not saying that he has wings that are spreading. Balrogs have never been described as having actual wings. They've never been described as flying or gliding or hovering or fluttering, but they're always running, leaping, climbing. Now, there is the next section where it says the wings spread to the far reaches of the cavern, but we already read the part that said the wings were an aura of shadow, not actual wings. That's what's called a mixed metaphor. Some people who insist that Tolkien stated they do fly point to the Silmarillion. There's a part in the Silmarillion that everybody points to when they make this argument. The Silmarillion's the keystone work of Tolkien's Legendarium, and they say it was described that the Balrogs were flying across the countryside, and then other people argue against this, and they say, well, in that context, flying refers to traveling at great speed. I have a different argument. I have a way better argument. The Silmarillion doesn't actually say that. It doesn't mention Balrogs flying across the countryside, nor does it say that they traveled with winged speed. That's another one that I hear a lot. That's not a phrase that's actually in the book. Here is the actual passage that people like to misquote. Balrogs lurked still, awaiting ever the return of their lord, and now swiftly they arose, and passing over Hithlum, they came to Lambeth as a tempest of fire. With their whips of flame they smote asunder the webs of Ungoliant, and she quailed and turned to fight, belching black vapours to cover her, and fleeing from the north she went down into Beleriand, and dwelt beneath Ered Gorgoroth, in that dark valley that was ever called Nan Dongothreb, the Valley of Dreadful Death, because of the horror that she bred there. Now, while it does say that they arose, it's because they started out in this traveling deep underground in the pits of Angband, and they had to come to the surface. It does not mention flight as a literal nor as a metaphor, just that they passed over Hithlum, meaning that they passed over it, not flew. When they came out to fight Feanor, it only said that they issued forth from Angband. When the Balrogs left after sacking Gondolin, it just says they departed to Angband. Once again, no mention of flight. I've gone through the Silmarillion and every mention of Balrogs. And Balrogs came, Balrogs left, suddenly Balrogs. In Glaurung's chain there was Balrogs. Glaurung, by the way, was a flightless dragon. Balrogs were about them. Morgoth loosed the Balrogs, and finally the Balrogs fled during the War of Wrath. So if Durin's Bane suddenly flew away, it would take a lot of explaining as to how that's actually possible, because, yeah, they can't fly, and they don't have wings. Next question. This one came in from Michael Williams, who asks, why did the Teleri not let the Noldor just borrow their ships? From my perspective, it seems like the Teleri and Valar seem to aid Morgoth in hindering the Noldor more than anything. You sound like this guy I know. His name is Feanor. They didn't give them the ships because the Valar didn't want them to. Feanor asked for the ships. They said no. They would rather dissuade the Noldor from going to Middle-earth than assist them in going to Middle-earth, and the reason was spelled right out. They did not wish to go against the will of the Valar. I don't really understand how you can say that hindering the Noldor helps Morgoth. Feanor was not willing to wait for the Valar to come up with any sort of plan to deal with Morgoth, and just assumed that they were going to let him get away with everything, and that it was all up to him. His grief and anger are understandable, but he was not acting rationally, and it was fully Morgoth's fault, for Morgoth had poisoned his mind. When Morgoth came to Formenos earlier, he reminded Feanor that he was a Vala, and told him about the race of men that were going to awaken in Middle-earth. This put several things into Feanor's head, that the Valar would side with Morgoth as they were his kin, that the elves were trapped in Aemon and could have been kings of vast lands in Middle-earth, and that men would usurp the place of the elves. And Feanor had a whole complex about being usurped, considering how he was about Fingolfin's entire existence. Okay, next question. This one's also from Michael Williams, and he asks, did the lower classes of the Númenóreans take part in the same corruption as Ar-Pharazôn and his court? From the descriptions that Tolkien gave us, most of Númenor fell under the cult of Melkorism. Of course, that's not to say that the lower class Númenóreans were all Melkorist priests and such, but a big part of this cult was ritual human sacrifice. So when you think about it, who do you think was getting sacrificed? The entirety of Númenor was enveloped by this cult, except for a few scant faithful that was revolved mostly around Elendil. This is why the downfall happened. Even if they had not attacked Aemon, they were considered a lost people at this point. All right, next question. Were the Barrow-wights still active after the downfall of Sauron? If so, I imagine Gandalf had an encounter on the way to Bombadil as he rode across the Downs. There is the possibility that the Barrow-wights may have been gone, but we can't really be sure. The Barrow-wights don't really have much to do with Sauron, but they may have had something to do with the Nazgul. Wights are certainly mortal spirits. They are somehow prevented from passing from the world and accepting the gift of man, likely through magical means, necromancy. The fact that there were anti-Nazgul weapons found near the Barrow-wight, mixed with the location and the proximity to the fallen kingdom of Angmar, it leads credence to the theory that the Wights were the lesser wraiths that Gandalf spoke of, that the Witch King could create lesser wraiths with his Morgul blade. With that in mind, it is possible that with the passing of the Rings of Power, the Barrow-wights may have finally passed from the world. Either way, though, even if they were still active, Gandalf might not have actually rode through the Barrow Downs. It wasn't the only way to get into the Old Forest. If you remember, they came out of the Barrow Downs at the beginning, but they didn't go in that way. And of course, he's coming from Bree, so it does make sense that he might go through there, but he didn't have to. But even if he did, he has nothing to fear from dead men. That wouldn't bother him. Okay, next question. Oh, this is more Feanor stuff. Was Feanor's love for the Silmarils genuine, or was it more of an obsession? For Feanor, it wasn't really about the Silmarils. The oath that Feanor and his sons took made it an obsession. By the wording of the oath that they took, they had to be obsessed. They had to kill anyone who got in their way. They had to retrieve the Silmarils. It wasn't just because Feanor wanted them back, nor was it because Feanor wished to alight the two trees again. He had already turned down that option when he was speaking to the Valar before he found out that the Silmarils were stolen. It was about revenge. Feanor wanted to punish Morgoth. He wanted to punish the Valar. He wanted to punish the elves. Morgoth killed his father, stole his jewels. The Valar felt like enemies to him when they approached him, and he felt as if Morgoth was their brethren, as I mentioned earlier, and that they were not going to ever really side against him, which was a thought, as I mentioned, implanted into his mind by Morgoth himself. And he wanted to punish the elves for not standing behind him, and Fingolfin in particular, just for existing. His mother had left, his father remarried, and by the special circumstances of that whole remarriage, Finwë's marriage to Miriel was essentially annulled, which would make Feanor illegitimate. Fingolfin disagreed with this. He saw Feanor as his perfectly legitimate older brother. Of course, Finwë still loved his son. And Fingolfin said, half-brother by blood, but full brother in his heart. But once again, the words of Morgoth festered in Feanor's mind. He would be usurped. He had been denied a vast kingdom in Middle-earth. Men would usurp his rightful place. Fingolfin would take his place, if not as the eldest prince, but in his father's heart. Feanor needed therapy. In giving himself a goal that he was locked into, by that oath, he was locked into fulfilling this goal at any and all costs. He made himself a determinator, and he made determinators out of his sons and his followers. They were forced on this path through a sea of blood and a mountain of bodies. And for what? To grasp the Silmarils in the end, 2 out of the 3, and be burned by them because the sons of Feanor had become wicked and the Silmarils were holy. They found no peace because instead of just talking out their problems, they allowed their passions to rule them, and they set a course that they could not deter from, even as the likes of Mathros wished to call off the quest. They rarely took counsel, not even from Mandos or Manwë. They allowed pride and hatred and blind ignorance to rule their lives, and instead of facing their own sorrows, they made the Silmarils the symbol of everything that they wished to attain, and most of them died. And those that attained it in the end had to wonder, why? Was it all worth it? Absolutely not. Okay, next question. This is a good one because it's a subject you don't get to talk about too often. This one came in from Mr. Great Wolf G, who asked, do we believe that the Legolas who led the survivors from Gondolin and the Silmarillion is the same Legolas who is in the Fellowship? What house do you reckon he would have descended from? Just a fun question, as we'll never know for sure. We actually do know for sure. They're a totally different guy. Legolas of Gondolin was a distinctly different character from Legolas of Mirkwood, mostly due to the fact that Legolas of Gondolin sailed west after the fall of Gondolin. This Legolas may or may not be canon to the Legendarium, because he's not actually in the Silmarillion, like your question mentioned. He's from the Book of Lost Tales, that specific version of the fall of Gondolin. But this version of the Fall of Gondolin has a lot of aspects that, they can be canon as long as they don't contradict the Silmarillion or the Lord of the Rings. And the existence of another elf named Legolas certainly doesn't cause any sort of contradictions. Legolas of Gondolin sailed to the west, and he settled in Tol where he changed his name to Laequalace, which is really just Quenya for Legolas. It means the same thing, green leaf. He was in the House of the Leaves. The House of the Leaves, by the way, that's where he got his name from. Of course, you could make the argument that he came back, like Glorfindel came back. And with Legolas of Mirkwood having a very murky past, pun not intended, it does seem possible, but it's not. For the fact that Legolas beheld the seabirds at Belfalas, and he felt a change in his heart. He would never be the same. The cry of the gulls instilled upon him the unquiet of Ulmo, the sea longing. If he had already sailed to the west at one point in the past, he would have already been aware of this, and he wouldn't need to have been warned about it by Galadriel, as he mentioned. So definitely 2 different Legolases. Okay, next question. This one came in from Stephen Lenori, who asked, in the Silmarillion, why couldn't Ulmo not use his command of the water to flood Utumno? Would this not have created peace for all of Ea by drowning the evil in one action? Yeah, and Iluvatar could have destroyed it with a meteor strike. But just because something is possible doesn't mean that it should be done. They had Melkor in their custody, and they had already done quite a bit more than enough damage to Middle-earth. And think about it. This was pretty far inland. The ocean wasn't close by. They would have had to flood a lot of Middle-earth to do this. Why should they damage Middle-earth further than they already had? Besides, drowning, it might have killed a bunch of orcs, but it wouldn't have killed the Balrogs, and it certainly wouldn't have killed Sauron. He survived a much greater ocean calamity later on. The Valar had realized how destructive to the planet using their powers for war would be, and they resolved to never do it again. Okay, let's see. Next question. This one is anonymous. Could Gandalf have defeated Saruman if he had used his full strength in battle instead of trying to reason with him in Isengard? So, I think you might be referring to the movie scene where they fought. They had like a wizard's duel. That didn't actually happen in the book. But I want to talk about the scene where Gandalf once again tries to reason with him at Isengard, which is in the Two Towers. And in that scene, that was Gandalf using his full power, a power that Saruman could not compete with, and he could offer no resistance to. Gandalf was the White, and Saruman was not the White any longer. He had abandoned his station, and he fashioned himself as Saruman of many colors. He stated, white is good for a start. Gandalf had the full authority backed up by God himself, Eru Ilúvatar, and he used his full power unleashed at Saruman, and all it took was words. And this is the real power of the wizards. When Saruman attempted to leave and not listen, Gandalf said, "Come back, Saruman." And he did. He was forced to, against his own will. When he said, "Your staff is broken," it shattered. When he told Saruman to leave, he was forced to crawl away. Gandalf stated, "You have no color." He was cast from the order, and Saruman was so stripped of all of his power, except that was innate to him, his charisma. There is no greater force than absolute authority that one is physically and spiritually compelled to follow. And we see that in the scene at Orthanc, and we see it at the scene earlier in the book. They didn't have a battle. Saruman didn't overpower Gandalf to take him prisoner. He simply told him that he was a prisoner. This was the word of the White. Gandalf couldn't offer any kind of resistance to that. Okay, next question. If Eru was the one who sent Gandalf back vastly more powerful than before as Gandalf the White, why didn't he just demote Saruman himself rather than having the wizard accomplish it? There's actually two reasons why Eru wouldn't do that. The first is that any sort of demotion is Saruman being not really demoted, but fired, if you think about it. Stripped of his power, stripped of his station. There had to be witnesses to this, and there were. Theoden, Gimli, Pippin, Merry, Legolas, a bunch of the Rohirrim. Treebeard wasn't very far away. People needed to know that Saruman was stripped of his authority and his power, lest he just bluff that he had great power still, which he even tried that later on in the Shire, but Frodo told all the Shire hobbits, no, he doesn't have any powers left, except for his charming voice. The other big reason is that Saruman needed to be given a choice, a second chance, basically. Everybody deserves a second chance. And Gandalf gave him that second chance. Repent, join the right side, or stick to your guns and try your luck. Gandalf offered a full pardon. As long as Saruman offered the key to Orthanc and his staff, he would be free to go wherever he wanted, even if it meant going straight to Mordor and joining Sauron. It was important that Saruman be given a shot at redemption, because everybody deserves that. Everybody deserves a shot at redemption, much as the Noldor who slew their kin, the Falmari, were given a chance to turn back and to repent, and some of them did, and they found forgiveness. Saruman took the choice of Feanor. He chose to stick with his guns, and it didn't work out too well for him. Okay, final question. This one came in from Lot Fan. Lord of the Rings fan. LotR fan. Were there any men of the Third or Second Age that could kill a Balrog? Probably not, no. Gandalf and the Balrog were more or less equals. There were times that there were children of Ilúvatar that faced them. That was the First Age, and they were elves. Glorfindel and Ecthelion both faced off and destroyed Balrogs, but they also both died in the attempt. Glorfindel's Balrog dragged him down into the pit as it fell, grabbed his hair. While it isn't mentioned exactly what happened with Ecthelion, just that he battled Gothmog to mutual destruction. In the Book of Lost Tales, which is an earlier version of the story, Ecthelion is said to specifically drown Gothmog along with himself. And Tuar, who was a man, slew 5 Balrogs in the story. But there's a lot of qualifiers here. At this point in the writing, Balrogs were much more numerous and much less powerful, thus accounting for Tuar slaying 5 Balrogs and not dying. Another thing to understand is that in this version of the story, Gothmog is not really a Balrog. He's the lord of the Balrogs, but he's not one of them. You can be the lord of something without being that thing. He is actually Melko's son, and his mother is an ogress. In universe, these lost tales are probably the tales of men. They're the tales of elves retold by men and sort of corrupted along the way, embellished, changed. While we could see heroes of the likes of, say, Tuor, Beren, Turin, possibly defeating a Balrog, and of course probably dying in the process, heroes like that were gone from the world by the time the Second Age came around. I would say that even Elendil probably couldn't stand up to a Balrog. Anyway, guys, I had a lot of fun. Really good questions this week. Send me more questions. There's a link to my Quora in the description. If you got all the way through the video, you must have enjoyed it. So leave me a like, leave me a comment, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next time.